Whenever the debate around public services flares up,
Yeah.
there's always this one question that just sort of hovers right at the center of the room.
Oh, absolutely. It never fails.
Right. It's like, can a developing nation just, legislate its way to European-style wealth and welfare simply by raising taxes on its citizens?
That's the dream, right?
Exactly. Or, and this is what we're getting into today, is it mathematically impossible to achieve that standard of living without fundamentally changing the sheer size of the economy itself?
Yeah, I mean, it is the ultimate fiscal million-dollar question. We see populations looking at the really robust safety nets of places like Denmark or Norway and wondering, why can't we just have that here? We pay our taxes.
They do pay so much in taxes, yeah.
Right. But when you pull back the curtain and actually look at the absolute numbers, the actual resources available per person, you start to realize that the math of social welfare is, it's far less forgiving than the politics.
And it is exactly that unforgiving math that we are answering today. So, welcome everyone to today's Deep Dive.
Yeah.
It is Tuesday, August 4, 2026, and you are tuned into Macroeconomy AI.
Glad to be here with you all.
The title of today's Deep Dive is Tax Revenue versus Social Welfare. And we've got a lot to get through.
We really do. We have an incredibly fascinating data set to explore with you today. It reflects a very comprehensive 2023 to 2024 baseline, complete with a major methodological revision that was literally just published yesterday, August 3, 2026.
Fresh off the press.
Exactly. It's a really deep look into the cold, hard mechanics of how states actually fund themselves.
We are so glad you've chosen to spend your time with us today. Your curiosity is honestly what drives this show. But before we jump in, just a quick reminder of what we do here.
Go for it.
Channel Macroeconomy AI, bringing a compilation of analyses and news on macroeconomics, technology, and artificial intelligence. And speaking of data-driven insights, this deep dive is brought to you by DataCore Analytics.
A very fitting sponsor for today's topic, honestly.
Totally. Because when you're managing enterprise data, you don't want projections masquerading as facts. DataCore provides real-time, observed data pipelines, so your business decisions are grounded in reality, not guesswork. Check out the link in the description to learn more.
Highly recommend them.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we can compare different countries, we really need to understand the reality of the baseline data. And our primary case study today is Brazil.
That's right. To anchor this discussion, we are looking at the 2023 government finance statistics for Brazil. And I have to say, the numbers are just staggering when you look at the raw totals.
Staggering how? Give us the scale here.
Well, Brazil's consolidated general government spending in 2023 was 45.3% of its entire gross domestic product.
Wow, almost half.
Almost half. In nominal terms, that is 4,958.4 billion reais. I mean, nearly 5 trillion.
Nearly 5 trillion reais. Okay, to put that 45.3% in perspective for you listening, the state is essentially acting as a middleman for nearly half of every single transaction, paycheck, and sale that happens in the entire country.
That's a great way to put it, yeah.
That is just a colossal footprint for the government to have in the economy. But governments don't have their own money, right? They only have taxpayers' money.
Right, exactly.
So to fund that massive 45% footprint, where is all that money actually going?
Well, that is exactly where the functional breakdown comes in what economists call the QFOG classification. It breaks down the spending into tangible categories.
Okay, so what's the biggest bucket?
Out of that massive budget, the largest chunk, taking up 16.8% of the country's entire GDP, goes directly to social protection.
16.8%, just on social protection.
Right. We're talking about public pension systems, retirement benefits, cash transfer programs, and massive housing initiatives. That is the absolute bedrock of their welfare state.
So almost 17% of all the wealth generated in the country is dedicated just to making sure people have basic income support and pensions.
Correct.
But wait, if that's 17%, that still leaves a massive chunk of that 45% footprint totally unaccounted for.
Right, so the next biggest slice is 11.3% of GDP, which goes to general public services.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
This is the machinery of the state. It's funding the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. But crucially, this category also includes the servicing of the public debt.
Wait, hold on. 11.3% of the GDP goes to running the government and servicing debt.
Yes.
That means before a single dollar or real reaches a doctor or a teacher or a construction worker building a road, a massive chunk of the nation's wealth is just paying the interest on the government's own credit card.
It's a structural anchor. That's the best way to describe it.
It's a massive anchor. I mean, that's just wild to think about.
It is. And it leaves way less room for the services that actually touch you directly every single day. For example, education receives 4.9% of GDP across all three levels of government.
Just 4.9%. Okay.
And health gets 4.7% of GDP, which primarily finances Brazil's universal public health care system.
Okay, so let's summarize this. We've just outlined a state that spends nearly half its wealth trying to guarantee housing, healthcare, and pensions while carrying this ridiculously heavy debt load.
Basically, yes.
Which brings us to the inevitable question of extraction, right? Like, how deep are they reaching into the average Brazilian's pocket to actually pay for all of this?
Well, in 2024, Brazil's gross tax burden hit 32.32% of its GDP.
32.32%.
Yes, and it's really important to note this actually represents an increase from 30.3% in 2023.
Okay, I feel like I've seen different numbers floating around, though. Didn't some reports say it was even higher?
Good catch. You might occasionally see slightly different numbers depending on the source. Some regional authorities attribute a 33.7% tax burden for 2024, but the Brazilian Treasury did a major reclassification just recently.
Oh, that methodological revision we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. Advised by the IMF, they removed certain structural funds from the general government perimeter to align their accounting strictly with international standards, bringing that official number to exactly 32.32%.
Got it. So we're looking at a tax burden north of 32%. Where does that put Brazil on the global stage? Because 32% honestly sounds incredibly high for a developing nation.
It is high. Out of the 27 countries analyzed in our source material, Brazil ranks 15th.
Okay, so kind of middle of the pack.
It sits right in the middle of the pack globally, yeah, but the regional context is what really matters here. A 32% tax burden is vastly higher than its Latin American peers.
Like who?
Well, Mexico sits down at 18.3%. Peru is at 16.3%.
Wow, so almost double Peru.
Exactly. It's even noticeably higher than the United States, which sits at 25.6%. However, Brazil remains well below the European benchmarks, particularly the Nordic countries, which, regularly tax their economies above 40%.
Right. But if we're taxing more than the United States and double the rate of Peru, why doesn't it feel like we have premium world-class services?
That is the million-dollar question.
Let's build a household budget analogy here for you listening to make this super clear. Imagine you live in a neighborhood, and you decide to put 32% of your monthly paycheck into a joint family account for home maintenance, healthcare, and savings.
Okay, I follow.
Your neighbors, the Nordics, they're putting 40% of their paychecks into their family accounts. And their houses are absolute mansions with pristine landscaping and private doctors on call.
Right, right.
Now, if you are taxing your quote-unquote income at 32%, but your house still looks like a fixer-upper compared to your neighbors, isn't the problem the absolute size of your paycheck rather than how you slice it?
What's fascinating here is that you have just perfectly identified the core illusion in macroeconomic policy debate.
It's a core illusion. I like that.
It really is an illusion.
Yeah.
Because there is a vital non-negotiable difference between relative size, which is tax as a percentage of GDP, and absolute resources, which we measure as GDP per capita in purchasing power parity, or PPP.
Purchasing power parity. Let's make sure that's crystal clear for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
That's the equalizer, right?
Yeah.
It adjusts the numbers so we can account for the fact that a cup of coffee or a standard doctor's appointment costs a lot less in São Paulo than it does in Oslo.
Exactly. It levels the playing field for the cost of living so we can compare the actual real-world standard of living. But I want to highlight a really strict methodological rule our sources used here, which is critical for you as a listener trying to parse economic news.
That's the rule.
When comparing this GDP per capita PPP, the research utilized only observed World Bank data for the current year. They completely purposefully avoided the IMF's World Economic Outlook projections.
But wait, why would they avoid projections? Aren't projections useful for forward-looking policy? Like, don't we want to know where the economy is going?
Normally, yes, but not when you are trying to establish a baseline of present reality. It is incredibly common for analysts or, data aggregators to accidentally pull a column of IMF projected data, say, forecasting 2 or 3 years into the future, and present it as current observed data.
Oh, and that skews the numbers.
Massively, because those projections compound expected nominal growth and inflation. If you use projections, it artificially inflates the GDP per capita across the board, making a country look wealthier on paper in absolute terms than it actually is today.
Ah, I see.
By strictly using observed World Bank data, this study strips away that statistical inflation. We are looking at the stark reality of what is currently in the bank.
So stripping away the projections and looking at the cold, hard cash in the bank, What does that stark reality look like when we measure the size of the national paycheck?
Well, Brazil's observed GDP per capita PPP is $19,080.
$19,080.
Okay, that is the entire economic output per person adjusted for cost of living. But when you look at the European benchmarks they are trying to emulate, their GDP per capita ranges from $50,000 to well over $100,000.
Wow. Okay. So even after we adjust for the fact that a doctor's visit is cheaper in Brazil, the European benchmarks are still working with a pie that is 3, 4, or 5 times larger per person.
Precisely. And this leads to the ultimate math problem.
Hit me with it.
If Brazil wanted to match the absolute dollar for dollar per capita public spending of those European benchmarks, if they wanted to provide that exact same physical quality of welfare, infrastructure, and services, how much would they need to tax?
Oh, boy. I feel like this number is going to be absurd.
The mathematical limit is staggering. The data shows that to match the average absolute per capita public spending of the 15 benchmark nations, Brazil would need to tax between 165% and 178% of its total GDP.
Here's where it gets really interesting and why you, listening to this, really need to care about this distinction. 178% of GDP. I want to make sure I'm hearing this right.
You are.
That means the government would have to confiscate every single dollar, euro, or real generated in the entire economy, take 100% of it, and then somehow find another 78% from a parallel universe just to match the European average.
It is a mathematical impossibility. The math simply does not exist. Let's look at specific scenarios. To match the absolute per capita spending of Denmark, Brazil would need to capture 200% of its GDP.
200%, so double their entire economy.
Exactly. To match Luxembourg, 388%.
That's just hilarious. 388%.
And even if you look at the quote-unquote cheaper welfare models in the developed world, like South Korea or Japan, which spend a smaller percentage of a very large pie, Brazil would still need to tax nearly 100% of its entire GDP just to match them, absolutely.
It's like trying to feed a party of 10 with a 30% slice of a pizza.
That's a perfect way to look at it.
Because the European countries, they're serving a 30% or 40% slice too, which makes the relative tax burdens look totally comparable on paper.
Right, but their pizza is an extra-large, deep dish, massive pizza.
Exactly. And the developing country is holding a tiny personal pan pizza. You can bump your tax rate to 50%. You can take half the personal pan pizza, and your citizens will still be hungry compared to the guys eating the extra large.
They absolutely will.
And yet, you constantly hear pundits arguing that if a developing country just closed a few tax loopholes or raised the top marginal rate on the rich by a few percentage points, they could fund a Nordic-style utopia.
We hear it all the time.
But this data proves that's a mathematical fiction. Squeezing higher rates out of a structurally smaller economic base simply cannot bridge a gap of that magnitude.
It cannot. The constraint isn't a lack of political will to tax. The constraint is a structural lack of economic scale. Two economies can have the exact same tax burden relative to their GDP, but the absolute resources that actually reach a hospital bed, a public school classroom, or a pensioner's bank account, those depend entirely on the absolute size of the GDP per capita. You simply cannot distribute wealth that hasn't been created yet.
That is the mathematical trap right there. So if a high tax rate doesn't automatically equal a massive public spending budget in absolute terms, what actually determines a state's capacity to spend?
That's a really important pivot.
Because it can't just be random, right? Is it demographics? Is it how efficiently the government is run?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the research did a deep dive into precisely that question. They ran a multiple regression model across 23 countries, testing several variables to see what statistically predicts the size of a country's public spending as a percentage of GDP.
Okay, what kind of variables did they test?
They looked at median age, the Human Development Index, government effectiveness, population density, and of course, the tax burden.
Okay, let's break down that regression model because that sounds like heavy statistical jargon. What did they actually find when they looked at these variables one by one?
In isolation, there are some very strong logical correlations. For instance, there is a strong correlation between an older population, a higher median age, and higher public spending.
Right.
The correlation coefficient is 0.61, which is quite high. And this makes perfect sense, right? As a population ages, the sheer demand for pensions and healthcare skyrockets. There are also strong correlations between government effectiveness and the Human Development Index when viewed in isolation.
Hold on, let me stop you right there. I get why tax burden matters, but surely demographics are the ultimate driver. If a country is older, mathematically, they have to spend more on pensions, right? You can't tell me the data says age doesn't matter.
Age matters immensely for the demand for spending. But what we are measuring is the capacity to spend.
Okay, what's the difference in the model?
Think of a multiple regression, like an audition for a band. When median age plays solo, they sound great. You think, yes, older countries definitely spend more. But when you put median age, HDI, and tax burden on stage together and force them to play the same song, tax burden completely drowns the others out.
Ah, so when all these variables compete in the model, the tax burden is the only one that actually predicts the outcome.
Exactly. When you force them to compete, only one remains a statistically significant predictor of public spending: the tax burden. The correlation is nearly mechanical, at 0.91. The other variables lose their statistical significance because they are highly intertwined. A country that is older tends to also be richer, more developed, and have higher institutional capacity to tax.
Right, they all kind of move together.
They do. But at the end of the day, within this 23-country sample, the only variable that directly guarantees you can spend more relative to your GDP is the mechanical ability to extract more taxes. It implies that in this specific group of countries, there's no statistical shortcut to higher public spending without higher tax collection.
Well, wait, I'm thinking of exceptions here. What about a country with abundant natural resources? Do they need high taxes if they can just sell off a mountain of copper or oceans of oil to fund their government?
That is a brilliant point, and the researchers knew this was a vital factor. So the data addressed this by running a specific scenario analysis on natural resource rents.
And what did they find?
They found a negative correlation, about minus 0.51. This suggests that countries heavily endowed with natural resources often use those resource rents to lower the tax burden on their domestic economy.
Okay, so the state gets its cut from the ground, not the people.
Precisely. We see this clearly in Latin America. Chile uses its vast copper wealth, and Colombia uses its oil wealth to finance the state. This allows them to maintain lower domestic tax burdens, around 20%, compared to Brazil's 32%.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. You essentially subsidize the state's budget with commodities instead of citizen income.
Yeah.
But wait, what about a country like Norway?
Norway.
Because Norway has massive, massive offshore oil reserves. They are incredibly resource rich, but they're also famous for having sky-high taxes. How do they fit into this negative correlation?
Norway is the ultimate policy exception, and it teaches us a profound lesson about the role of institutions. Norway has very high natural resource rents. About 10.1% of their entire GDP comes from resources like oil.
Which is huge.
It is huge, yet they simultaneously maintain a very high domestic tax burden of 40.2%.
Why? I mean, why tax your citizens if you're drowning in oil money?
Because they made a deliberate, incredibly disciplined institutional choice. It is politically very easy to find oil and tell your citizens, great news, we are cutting taxes.
Right. Every politician's dream.
Exactly. Instead, Norway taxes its citizens heavily to run the day-to-day state, and they funnel the oil wealth into a sovereign wealth fund.
It's famous government pension fund global.
Yeah.
They basically locked the oil money away.
Exactly. They invested the commodity windfall into global markets to secure the future for generations to come, rather than artificially propping up today's budget.
It takes a lot of discipline.
It really does. What Norway proves is that taxation and spending levels are ultimately an institutional choice. The negative correlation we see in other resource-rich countries where they use oil to avoid taxing citizens isn't an economic inevitability. It's a political decision to substitute taxes with resource rents. Norway chose a different, much harder path.
That is so incredibly illuminating. It really highlights that while math provides the hard limits of what's possible, institutions make the choices within those limits. So to bring this all together for you listening, what is the ultimate strategic takeaway from all this data?
The core takeaway is this: long-term increases in absolute social welfare, the kind of wealth that actually builds world-class hospitals, modern infrastructure, and secure retirements, depend fundamentally on growing the overall productivity and the GDP per capita of the nation.
The pie itself must grow.
Yes. It cannot be achieved just by squeezing higher tax rates from an already highly taxed, smaller economic base. Trying to match European welfare levels purely through taxation in a developing economy is a mathematical dead end.
You simply can't tax your way out of a productivity deficit. And that leaves me with a final, somewhat provocative thought for you to mull over.
Let's hear it.
Think about the demographic transition we debated earlier. The data clearly shows that as populations age, the demand for public spending rises. Pensions and healthcare become incredibly expensive. Well, what happens if a developing nation, which hasn't yet grown its GDP pie to European levels, starts aging rapidly?
It's a scary thought.
It really is. If the demands of an elderly population hit a state that is mathematically incapable of taxing above 100% to meet those European benchmarks, are we looking at the inevitable collapse of social protection models in the developing world? It's a race between wealth creation and demographics, and it's absolutely something to seriously mull over on your own.
Indeed it is. And before we close, I must gravely and clearly state the following. Please note, this content has an exclusively informative documentary and educational character, compiling data, projections, and analyses from public market sources. It does not express ideological bias and does not constitute investment, financial, legal, or tax advice. Economic projections are subject to frequent revisions, and past performance does not guarantee future returns. Always consult qualified professionals before making strategic decisions.
Thank you so much for breaking down those massive numbers with us today and giving us such a clear picture of the mechanical reality behind the political rhetoric.
It was my pleasure, truly.
And a huge thank you to all of you for joining today's deep dive. If this sparked some new ideas for you, we invite you to tune in to our future broadcasts as we continue to untangle the complexities of the global economy. That was today's Macroeconomy AI. We'll leave it here. You all stay well and keep an eye out for our new broadcasts. Subscribe to our channel, access the links, and follow Macroeconomy AI on social media. Bye.